I'm going to get in a little trouble here by asking this question. Welcome to the Assessment Engineers. Today, we're talking about what it actually takes to build AI assessment products that work in production. I'm joined by Kate Hake. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Kevin.
So Kate and I sort of represent the two sides of the coin when it comes to building assessment products. Kate focuses all her time on building all the core components, and I help companies integrate them and build the final products with them. So I'm really excited to dive in today. Kate, why don't you tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, so I'm a VP of product at Learnosity. I focus on AI, so I focus on our AI labs team here in Dublin. But I've been at Learnosity for about 5.5 years. I started in the math space, so a mathematician by trade. And I also spent some time more K-12 higher ed, and now I'm focusing mostly on AI.
And I'm Kevin. I'm the vice president of K-12 here at Learnosity. I started my career 12 or 13 years ago as a full stack engineer in the education technology space. Nowadays, I do more high-level architecting, but still, I love building assessment products, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Kate, I'm excited to talk to you because you have some pretty unique experiences when it comes to building actual AI products. It feels like every company on Earth, like 2 or 3 years ago, had an AI demo. We're playing around with it, but some of them came to fruition, some of them fizzled out. But you've really led a couple into the market, really, created some of the flagship Learnosity AI products. What were the toughest challenges and the biggest lessons learned in turning that initial tech demo that we had a couple years ago into that fully fledged AI product and building a team around it?
Yeah, I think it still is a really exciting time because you can put together a demo really quickly. You had just like decent prompts, you had something that you could show, and that demo works well. It only has to work sort of once. It only has to work for maybe a few different responses or a few different examples. But when you actually want to take that and bring it fully to market, there's a lot more to consider because now you have to think about every single edge case. It has to work consistently. It has to work at scale. And there's so much more that goes into play when you actually think about bringing that fully to market. So, at Learnosity, we have 50-ish item types. And so if you're building out a tool that can do content review or content management, it's not just thinking about a multiple choice items, but it's thinking about all the different varieties of item types of content that you're going to see, whether it's audio, it's video, it's math, and making sure that you have something that really works across all of the different use cases, maybe edge cases that real people are going to be inputting. And there's also such an important part about figuring out what does a good AI product actually look like, especially across different features. And so having that conversation up front, sort of having a discussion around, okay, for this specific tool or this specific feature, quality means something different than maybe somewhere else. And how do we actually evaluate that? How do we set up the right sort of framework to be able to test that, to monitor that? So I think, I wouldn't underestimate all of the efforts and the resources that go to actually, bring it to market, to host, to maintain, to monitor a product. It goes so much farther beyond than just that like really exciting initial demo.
So I'm going to get in a little trouble here by asking this question with maybe a little trouble with our CEO, but I know our CEO is a really big ideas guy. And I think you're in a position that a lot of product managers are out there in, which is they've got a board, they have a leader, they've got a CEO that has a lot of different ideas for what the direction they want their product to go in or the AI tools they want to start using. So how do you manage that? What is that like to have sort of someone come to you with sort of the start idea? You have to determine what's going to work, take that to market. What is that experience like?
Well, one thing that's exciting now is you can actually build a prototype faster. And so that discovery phase is a lot quicker. And so you can kind of actually test out that idea a lot faster without investing too much. And so that's really great because if there are a lot of ideas, maybe you can whittle down a few of them, but you can actually just bring it to a customer, bring it to someone and kind of get their take without you investing in that entire production build. So that's a really exciting time to be able actually to see from people we work with what's actually going to solve problems and add real value.
I'm curious from your point of view, what are the hidden difficulties or gotchas or maybe things that people underestimate when they're building out assessment products? In my experience, when I'm talking to clients, one of the biggest things in my point of view that people miss is the complexity of the authoring tools. We often talk about the assessment lifecycle having sort of these three pillars, right? It's authoring, then assessment, then analytics. It's the creation of content, the delivery of that content, and then we're trying to learn something about students. I think if you take the example of the simplest version of that you could possibly imagine, which is just a multiple choice question. We're just delivering like a multiple choice quiz to students and then learning something about the students. I think it's very easy for someone building a product to understand, not saying it's simple to do, but it's very easy to understand the complexities of like kind of delivering that to a student. And then at the end, like, obviously analytics a little more complicated. But when it comes to authoring, I think people often underestimate the amount of work that goes into it. As an example, it's not just an author having the ability to tweak the look and feel of every question type and what's actually on the page, but it's things like the metadata around it. It's tagging it to the right standards. It's, they may have complicated workflows. I know very few authors that can just go in, type out a question and then that's ready for students, right? It goes through drafts, it goes to other authors to confirm. And then, what if they go and change the content after it's gone live? How does that work? All those complexities, I think, are things when people first think about their assessment product, I think they sort of understand that student experience side of things very quickly, but that authoring side can totally surprise them. That's sort of the baseline authoring tool that an author is going to need is going to be way more complicated than maybe you first imagined, which is why I recommend anyone building products out there, involve your content people way earlier than you think, because you'll learn a lot as you're building and you'll hear the things they really need as they go.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And from my own background, like when you take all that complexity you're talking about and then you bring it into the math space and science, so content authors are going to need the right tools to be able to add mathematical notation inside of their content. That's not just in the question, that could be incorrect answers and feedback. So having tools that support that, but also handle accessibility when it comes to just the content and making sure, that screen readers can appropriately interpret the mathematical notation. But then when you think about scoring, if we're having open-ended questions and we're not just having, a multiple choice question, being able to have that flexible scoring engine that can handle the differences that we're going to see in students' responses. Two people might get they both might have the same correct answer, but it varies slightly differently in the format or the way, that it's expressed because they solved it differently. And so we want to make sure they both get credit for that. So how do you build a system that can handle that variance, but also makes it sort of comprehensible for the authors so that when they're setting the correct answer, they have that control, because sometimes they may want to be a bit more lenient and sort of allow those different variations. And sometimes they might want to be a bit more strict depending on their learning outcomes. So there's a lot that comes into it, from creating content that's accessible, but also being able to score mathematical expressions and to handle that variance.
What actually makes an AI-enabled assessment or feedback or, an AI-integrated student experience actually better for a learner?
Two things that come to mind for me are specificity and then timing. So being able to get feedback that's actually targeted towards my response and is not just a sort of generic good job or a like, this is incorrect and here's maybe why, just generically about, here's a correct answer. Something that actually brings in my own thinking, my own response and ties it to help me sort of understand where I need to improve. So I think that specificity, that personalization is really great. And then also timing is a big factor as well. So if a student's getting their feedback, a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, they've already sort of moved on. They may be building on different skills. And so being able to get that feedback faster, that's going to be really beneficial. And so AI gives us great opportunities to not only get more targeted feedback, but in a quicker turnaround.
Yeah, and this ties right into what we talked about at ASU GSV, which is this concept, I think, of sort of connecting to student thought at a much greater scale. Essentially, assessment for the last 100 years, we've been able to scale it to quite a large amount of students. You can assess on paper multiple choice questions. For 100 years, we've been able to assess millions of students at once. It really hasn't been too challenging. But the problem with that is we arrive at this sort of binary, you got this question right or wrong, you got this question right or wrong, and do all of our analysis based on that. AI, I think, allows us to tap into that student thought process of like how they arrived at their conclusions, line by line, really understanding whether it's math or essays, like sort of getting that journey, which I think the more we're able to make that easy for teachers and graders to understand, the far better the experience is going to be for the students, because it's not just like you got 7 out of 12, and that's the end of the story. It really is a deeper piece of feedback based on the actual journey they've gone through. And I think that's a lot better. It's a lot less frustrating, in my experience as a student, real feedback on where your thought went wrong, not just an analysis of right versus wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you see as the gap between what people think an AI and assessment can do and what actually works in production?
One thing that's been interesting for us is we're thinking about AI scoring. I think people just think, well, whatever I was using before, like whatever maybe scoring rubrics or marking schemes that I had that worked well for humans, for teachers grading, well, I'll just use that for my AI marking now. And I'll just sort of transfer that rubric and I'll just put it straight into the system. And one thing that we've sort of learned is that sometimes there's a lot of additional context that was never written into that rubric. Maybe it was discussed in a room or it was, discussed in one of these sort of sessions with markers. And so on that end, making sure, the AI marking, it can be reliable and it can be consistent if it has the right context. So thinking about what additional context do you actually have to give AI systems? What sort of ways do you actually have to rewrite your marking schemes so that they're a bit more sort of aligned to the way that, an AI marking or assessment is going to work? And so that's been an interesting conversation to kind of go and say, okay, maybe the tools that you had that worked really well in this context where you had maybe teachers or marker grading, but what do I actually have to adapt to make sure that I have like a quality outcome? And you might have to rewrite things in certain ways and make sure there's no ambiguity. But it's really important, right? If it has all that context, it's going to do like a great job and maybe even more consistent job than those graders were doing before.
From my experience, I think it's the one I see most is it feels like to me there are teams out there that are integrating AI into the product and not really knowing why or not having a real problem that they're solving. Maybe they're just getting pressure from boards or CEOs, something like, we just need AI in the product, and they add in some kind of chatbot. I think for every AI tool that you launch in your product, you really have to be able to specifically say in one sentence the problem it's solving for your end users, or else one, you sort of introduce two problems, in my opinion. The first is your end users aren't really going to understand, like, this is just like a chatbot that's sort of connected to my data, but I don't really know what to do with this or what problem does this solve. But also from like a product positioning point of view, if you just sort of have a sort of an open-ended AI product inside of what you're delivering, you open yourself up to compete with every kind of AI chatbot that's out there, all of the major players, right? If your tool is just, you can interact with this and ask it educational questions, right? You could do that at you could use that at ChatGPT or Claude, like whatever tool you want to use, you can sort of interact with that in the same way. So I think it's important when we're building AI tools to really think about what problem does this solve? And of course, is this a problem that exists and needs solving? But like really think about that before we're just sort of slapping AI. Because I think the end result is people really don't actually interact with those AI tools.
Yeah, and I think like what the worst case scenario is when you have these little AI moments that are put there without actually solving a problem, then you miss out on the ones that might be really useful and might be so essential because you just get a bit sort of overwhelmed with AI being everywhere. So I definitely agree. We want to make sure that we're actually solving true problems, that people take advantage of the tools that are really going to save them time.
Yeah, I think also sort of having a tighter integration of those AI tools into your actual product, as opposed to like being on the side, something like that can definitely help with that. What do authors and publishers actually need from AI authoring tools?
I think ultimately they really need a tool that's going to create content that mimics the content they had before. So what I mean is being able to actually follow their writing guidelines and their style and sort of pull from their content. They don't just want something that, sure, it can create a bunch of content quickly, but if it's generic content that's not sort of mapped to their own style, I think it's not really as beneficial as it could be. So making sure that they can sort of input that information, they can set the appropriate, maybe it's difficulty level, what's the audience meant to be, here's the appropriate style that we'd like to write in, that's going to be essential. And then going beyond that, if you're creating a lot of content with AI, being able to tag it appropriately or manage it appropriately is going to be so important. So you don't just have a lot of content being created without knowing how you're going to organize and manage all of that.
Yeah, it's crazy from my perspective how different two, similar seeming content teams can be, like in what they are trying to achieve, what, the way they go about things. So it makes total sense. For me, what I'm sort of most excited about in this space and what I think is going to provide a lot of benefits in the long term is sort of this idea of using AI for this bulk sort of analysis of item banks. Like to me, that's such a value for publishers and people creating content because there's so much great content out there that might not be modernized. You might not be sure it's accessible. You might, it might not be quite the right format, and there's millions, if not billions of items that are like that, right? So this ability for us to build AI tools that are going and looking at the big picture, the whole item bank, and identifying problems and modernizing all of the content and making sure it's ready for prime time, I think it'll be really impactful and allow even, sort of smaller size companies to have much larger item banks to use in a lot of different scenarios. What guardrails are essential when AI is involved in grading or feedback or learner outcomes?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is going to be accuracy. So, we spend a lot of time testing our, AI grading tool against data sets that we have that have been marked by teachers or professional graders to make sure that there's an alignment there with what our tool is providing as a score and, what the true score actually should be. But also beyond just accuracy, I think reliability, that consistency is also so key. If two different students or two different test takers, if they both submit very similar responses, we really want to make sure that they get the same score. So those are really the key things that we're looking for when it comes to the score. But then when you come to feedback, it's a different sort of evaluation because now there's a lot of different factors that we're thinking about. You still have that accuracy point. You want to make sure that it's relevant to your content. But then you want to make sure, is the feedback actually, say, appropriate for their grade level? Is the vocabulary that's used actually going to be helpful for them? Is it action oriented? So there's a lot of different metrics that we bring in when we want to test and what the quality of that feedback looks like. And then of course, if this is being presented back to students or test takers, we want to make sure there's no harmful content in there. So having the appropriate guardrails in place so that there's no AI generated, maybe inappropriate or sort of harmful content being put there. So we think about accuracy and consistency when it comes to scores, but there's a lot of different quality metrics that we think about when it comes to the actual feedback.
And I'm really excited we were just talking about this because I know it's something you're building like right now.
Yeah.
But I'm very excited for personally identifiable information masking, that sort of ability to, if you ask the question, you have an essay that's like, explain why, explain what you thought of the last chapter that you read. A student can obviously just go and say, my name is Billy and this is my street address, right? So that's a little scary. And any time you're basically have an open response, that's always a potential possibility. And you want to be sure to cover that. And until now, it's been a very difficult thing to sort of say, to be able to detect that. Essentially, it was a manual process. But now with AI, that's something you can sort of do in a much more automated fashion. Now I know you're building the moderation agents to sort of go in and make sure anytime there's a moment like that, it's simply redacted and is no longer a part of, the content that's being shown. We get asked a lot about accessibility. It's got to be the number one question we're asked most frequently when we work with our clients. What do teams get wrong when they think they can just add on accessibility or vibe code it? What are the challenges there when it comes to accessibility?
Yeah, so we've learned that you need to build with accessibility in mind. So that's something that's just a part of our sort of company culture. Products thinking about that when they're running design requirements. Designers are building the right components. All the engineers are doing the testing appropriately. Because if you think about accessibility as like an added feature or you try to add it on after, there's going to be so much extra time just sort of wasted on that because it's so much more complex if you don't have it at the front. So one thing I think people need to keep in mind when you now think about vibe coding or maybe building these POCs that then become almost live products is if you're going to have to add accessibility after, you're going to fall into that same trap. So really making sure that it's still a consideration, even when you're sort of quickly putting together product demos. If that ends up becoming your product, you're going to have to make sure accessibility is there. It's not just some added feature. So still keeping it in mind in the beginning, I think is going to be a really big consideration.
Yeah, and I think there's broadly kind of two categories we can think of when we think about accessibility, which is one is the content accessible, like does it have the right alt text on images, like the things we're creating, that accessible? And I think that's something AI can be helpful with. But fundamentally, we're talking about when we're thinking about accessibility tools, like the way that we're interacting with the tools on the page. Fundamentally, that's a very like physical thing. That's something that's very sort of human, the way we're physically interacting with keyboards, the way that it sounds to us, right? when it comes to accessibility. So I think it would just be, crazy to, as an example, code something without saying, oh, this definitely works with Braille keyboards, without going out and physically buying a Braille keyboard and testing everything yourself, right? So I think AI might be able to be a starting place for these things, but ultimately you have to go out and actually test these things and confirm they works and confirm the experience is good for every kind of user you have on your site. What part of assessment will feel completely different 2 years from now?
We talked about feedback being more specific and timely as being really powerful. I think we see a lot more personalization, not just from this feedback's targeted to you, but actually building out sort of personalized learning pathways. So I think that's a really exciting area to have much more like personalized learning across the board. I also think there's a big opportunity for better insights. So not just thinking about, if we're thinking about scoring and grading and feedback, maybe that's moving beyond written assignments to maybe audio and video and project-based, but also thinking about the insights that authors can get from just understanding their item bank, understanding sort of the health of it, understanding where there's gaps, and having that be so much easier to sort of comprehend all of that assessment data. How do their items actually perform, and kind of having different ways that people can interact with all of their data, whether that's your item bank content or maybe that's assessment data, and being able to pull insights in much more richer and more easier ways.
It's such a good point about the personalized learning pathways and sort of that adaptive style of learning. Because I think what's funny is, I would say 5 or 6 years ago, adaptive learning was like what everyone was talking about. Really, it was like a big focus for the industry. But despite everyone asking us about it, really very few people actually went and implemented. I think because of the challenges of creating all the right content for every type of learner, of analyzing all that data, because those are such big hurdles, even if the ability to create adaptive engines was possible at the time. But now I think the hurdles for those things, like the difficulty, is much less, and personalized learning pathways become much more feasible thanks to AI. And I think from my point of view, I'm most excited about how that I talked a bit about this, but the power of going through the whole item bank and really doing analysis on every aspect of all the items throughout your whole item bank will allow what I see as smaller publishers, smaller players to be able to compete with larger publishers and larger players. Because really, in my experience, it's really only a top handful who can really create the content to do everything that they want to be able to have all the learning pathways that they want to be able to, serve up the right content for every type of student. That's really hard. It's a very manual process. And I think as that becomes more and more advanced, is that it becomes easier and easier for smaller teams to create larger item banks and manage them for the long term. I think you're going to see smaller and mid-sized players be able to compete in sort of having all the right content, having all the great content for every kind of student. This is exactly why we're putting all this effort into Item Bank Health Track, which is essentially our tool to do just this. The ability to go and take your content and align it to the correct standards, or to make sure it's accessible, or to flag any problems with the content. To me, it just makes the management of a large item bank to be much easier. You can feel a lot more confident going live with a much larger item bank. And to me, that's a very powerful thing for, again, those smaller, mid-sized companies.
And it's exciting when we show this to customers. Item Bank Health Check has around 12 different jobs it can run. And then you'll have someone who gets so excited about, wait, can you just do this one thing for me that'll like save me so much time? And they just get so excited about the opportunity, and to be able to just keep adding in more features that are really going to make such a big difference for someone is exciting.
Yeah, and I like one of the things we've always done as a company historically is those ideas. We never build anything exclusively for one client. It's always, we take these ideas and we add them on to the whole industry can really take advantage no matter what we're building. And that's true for Item Bank Health Check. So it's exciting to see it grow. What advice would you give a project manager, technical lead, someone like that who has AI assessment, an idea on their roadmap right now?
I think if you have an idea, I would think a bit about that evaluation problem. So how are you going to know if it's working? What does good and a good outcome actually look like here? How are you going to get the appropriate data to be able to actually test that, and make sure you sort of have that groundwork there? And then I would really think about, can you talk to someone in the industry, some sort of SME, maybe that's a teacher, maybe that's someone who has maybe a pedagogical background. Can you sort of bounce that idea past them and make sure that, it really sounds like it's going to be helpful and sort of validates that idea you have, but also how you're going to measure its success. So making sure, right, we talked about this earlier, like, are we really solving problems? But also, is it going to be like grounded in the best sort of assessment principles? And so understanding what's going to be good. And if you can like validate that with someone else, I think that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I would say talk to us first of all. Definitely. Even if a partnership doesn't make sense, please, if you're watching this, talk to. I'd love to talk, and we'd love to share our experiences. But the biggest advice I have is just, again, to involve as many people across your organization as you can. I think looking at tons of different experiences as far as how they'll use the tools, ways in which they imagine their authors or people analyzing the data, like all these people, the more you can involve them in like looking at the things you're building, I think the stronger the product ends up being in the end. What benefit does AI have for builders?
I think we talked a bit about being able to, like we said, prototype faster, kind of go through that ideation phase faster. So that is really exciting to be able to sort of test out different solutions, whether that's actually like we're talking a bit more about demos, but that even just might be the more technical solutions about, if I'm going to take different paths, there's different ways to solve a problem, being able to actually sort of quickly test those out and truly understand pros and cons. I think that's exciting as, smaller sort of focus teams, they can move a lot faster when they bring in those principles.
And I often talk about this with the companies we work with, but I think really strong companies do everything they can possible to maximize their time on working on the parts of their product that actually differentiates them. I think one of the great things about AI is it makes, I think, the rest of the 90% of your product, the stuff that sort of is already done, or the common components that every platform needs to have, right? It makes that stuff a lot easier, which allows you to put way more focus on those parts of your product that really brings people away from your competition, really differentiates you as a product. It'll make you way stronger in the long term. And by the way, that's where you want, in my opinion, sort of the least AI helping you build, because it should be totally unique. It should be something that no one's ever done before, right? It should be totally something that you do above and beyond anyone else in the market. So obviously you're going to have AI helping you build, but like it should be a very hands-on building experience versus the rest. Anything you can sort of say is just generically needs to be done. AI can help you, partnerships can help you, right? You sort of want the beauty of AI. I think it allows for that maximizing your time on the things that are really important to you as a business. Kate, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.